Good morning, and welcome to the weekly worship service of First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church of Fort Worth, Texas. We are pleased to be able to offer you the safety of in-home worship, as we have every Sunday since March, until the danger from COVID-19 is properly contained. Welcome, whether you are watching on Sunday morning, or a weekday afternoon, or maybe some distant point in the future. Welcome, whether you are local, from across the country, or visiting us from abroad. However you came to be watching, know that you are welcome, and we are glad to share this service with you. This week's service is being held in the week between Christmas and New Year's. It's being held in a building that's mostly empty, and it's being broadcast out into the universe made up of clusters of things in wide open space. This week's theme is the space between boundaries, distance, and definitions. This week's worship team includes our pianist, Mikhail Brestnev. Our song leader is Dan Levine. Manning our tech desk is Patrick Gutierrez. And though he's not with us today, we want to thank, as always, Guy Thornton, our technical director. So let us begin with some music. Our opening words today are by Cynthia Landrum. Spirit of life and love, we gather together in different ways this morning. From computer screens, from telephones, from car radios. We gather reaching out across the wires, waving from a safe distance. To come together in religious community. From living room to front porch to car seat, we gather as we are able, ready to be of service to each other, to the world, ready to build the community of hope and of love. As we face this bright morning, we are far apart, but we are together, offering our love, our commitment, our hope, and our prayers in service to one another and this world. It's a new way, but an old way, that we come together in worship today. Our opening hymn is hymn number 1000 in the gray hymnal, if you happen to have one. Morning has come. The words will be on your screen.
Morning has come, Arise and greet the day. Dance with joy and sing a song of gladness. The light of hope here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. A new day dawns, once more the gift is given. Wonder fills this moment shared together. The light of peace here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. Open our eyes to see that life abounds. Open hearts to welcome it among us. The light of love here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home.
We'll light the chalice today with my own words. And as I light this chalice, I want you all to imagine your own light, from your heart or your mind or wherever you keep it, joining with the light of others across the distance and even time that might separate us. We light this flame as a symbol of our community. May its warmth welcome those in need of, May its warmth welcome those in need of encouragement. We light this chalice as a symbol of our commitment. May its light be a beacon to those seeking truth and meaning. We light this chalice this morning as a symbol of our worship. May it serve as a focus for that which is the best within us and in all of us together. And now, as we do each week, we will say our covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve others in community, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with creation. Thus do we covenant with one another.
Since what we choose is what we are, and what we love we yet shall be, the goal may ever shine afar. The will to win it makes us free.
In our services this year, we've largely avoided the typical sermon. Instead, we've mostly been looking at questions each week. And the person standing where I am gives their answers to you, or at least some reflections on how one might go about answering the questions. The point is not to tell you the right answer, but to inspire you to really examine the question for yourself. If you'd like to talk about the questions with me, or with other people who watched this within the 50-ish hours after it gets posted, there will be a chance to talk about it in a Zoom meeting on Tuesday evening. The link and the details are in the weekly email, and if you don't get the weekly email, please contact our administrator to get on that list. It's administrator@firstjefferson.org. This morning's questions are, why are space and distance important enough for all of this? Why does it seem that humans have a need to define things? How do we set healthy boundaries? Let me start off with our time for all ages. If there are kids around you, please invite them over. If not, please imagine all the kids gathered around screens in their own houses watching this with you. Today's Time for All Ages was inspired by Molly Housh Gordon's Beyond Every Door, which is posted on the UUA's worship web. Imagine with me for a minute where each of these doors might lead. The idea of a doorway, a boundary or a threshold to be crossed over or through, has a name: liminal. Liminal is an adjective, a describing word for the boundary between two things, whether they are physical or emotional or 2 points in time. It can be a door or a hallway or a staircase. A graduation is liminal, both as you cross the stage and as you cross from one point in life to another. Right now, we are in a liminal time, waiting on the new year. It's a word for that space, that distance in between. With several movie adaptations out now, I bet many of you have seen, maybe even read, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I'm only going to talk about the beginning of the book, so I won't spoil much for those who don't know the story. In the beginning of the story, a girl named Lucy looks for the perfect place to hide and opens up the door to a big wardrobe, which is a kind of freestanding closet. She goes through the door and heads to the back of the wardrobe, and she thinks she's pushing past coats and sweaters and furs and trying not to trip on boots. But at some point, she pushes a tree limb. She steps over a fallen branch. Suddenly, she's in a whole other world. A magical world with witches and fauns and talking beavers. The wardrobe, for a minute, was the doorway, the liminal space between her world and the other. Wouldn't it be cool if there were a magical world beyond every door? When Lucy opened the door to Narnia, it didn't look like anything special. It was just a boring door to a wardrobe full of clothes and coats. But across the threshold was magic. Lucy already had one foot in Narnia before she realized what was happening. Many of the boundaries in our lives are like this. We don't know that we're crossing into another world until we're halfway there already. The door of a church can take us down a pathway of growth that we might never have expected. The door to a doctor's office suddenly opens out into a life with new labels for what's going on inside our bodies. A restaurant door opens onto a first date, and that echoes forward into the relationship of a lifetime. A beloved person's door closes behind you, and suddenly your heart is broken. The door to a library or a gym or a dance studio introduces you to a life's passion you might not otherwise have discovered. We cross these thresholds every day of our lives, for good and for bad, in joy and in sorrow and in bittersweet truth. Truly, our own front door is even a great threshold. No matter how familiar the worlds within or without may be, given the constant change in our lives, every day we open that same old door only to step out into a new world that's been refreshed with the new day. In this way, there really is a new world behind every door, awaiting our discovery, if we'll only take it on with that in mind. Our first question was recorded in the weekly update as, what is the importance of space and distance? The real question I felt like I had to answer first, though, was, why are space and distance important enough to be the topic of a worship service? Now, some of you won't take any convincing, but stick with me because I'm going to set the tone. Let me begin by introducing a term, proxemics. It's the study of the human use of space from a desktop to a home or office building to an entire town. There's a field of science studying how we use space and what it says about us individually and as a culture. So I have some backing when I say that space matters. But let me break it down more simply. I'm standing in a church right now. You can look at the walls and the furnishings and the shape of the roof, and you can tell that it's a church. But the walls and even the carefully designed roof are really there to provide this space. The part we make use of is the space between the parts we built. The structure is there to provide and protect that space. Similarly, think of a set of flatware, the tools we eat with. There's a knife, a flat, maybe slightly edged thing that rarely goes anywhere near our mouths. Instead, we scoop food with a spoon. Now, the major difference between the knife and the spoon is that the spoon has a bowl. There's a space designed for us to fill. Or maybe we use a fork. We stab or we twirl. Why a fork instead of a spoon? Again, it's the space between the tines. How we use space, how we divide it, is essential to how we live our lives as tool-using animals. From the way a screwdriver fits into the screw to the way a keyboard is laid out, the use of space and distance is important to what we think of as technology. And how we decorate and light a room, or how we lay out a table setting for a meal, how much space we take up when speaking or crossing a room, how we use space is important to culture and interaction as well. In fact, how we use space has been shown to be an aspect of mastery of a skill. Let me read to you now from a paper first printed in the journal Artificial Intelligence back in 1995. Dr. David Kirsch is a professor and past chair of the Department of Cognitive Science at the University of California in San Diego. In his article, The Intelligent Use of Space, he argues that the use of space around us is an integral part of the way we think, plan, and behave, a central element to the way we shape the very world that constrains and guides our behavior. He says that whether we're aware of it or not, we're constantly organizing and reorganizing our workspace to enhance performance. Space is a resource that must be managed, much like time or memory or energy. When we use space, we can often bring the time and memory demands of our tasks down to workable levels. We can increase the reliability of execution and the number of jobs we can handle at once. The techniques we use are not always obvious nor universal. Some were taught to us and some naturally evolved as we improved our performance through practice. Some are the inevitable consequences of having the type of bodies and manipulators and sensors that we have. In every case, though, the reason space can be used to simplify our cognitive and physical tasks is because of the way we are embedded in the world. He tells a story, for instance. A study done where an experienced cook is brought into an unfamiliar kitchen and then recorded making a salad. The cook cuts up vegetables to be used and lays them out in neat columns on the countertop, then fetches a platter that she had never seen before. He reports that she then placed it beside the rows and began arranging the items along the circumference. The objective, as was evident from both observation and later questioning, was to lay out the platter so that all the cut items were in uniform and aesthetic manner. She didn't want to run out of tomatoes early, leaving a tomato-less region, or to close the ring of vegetables before all the ingredients, the peppers and the mushrooms and the tomatoes, were used up. The placement problem our cook faced was to apportion the ingredients in a uniform manner. This required either elaborate planning beforehand, recall of some similar case experience, or online tracking of the relative number of slices. Now, having never worked with this elliptical platter, our cook had no ready case to call on. And since it's much easier to compare things in neat lines than to actually measure the circumference of a platter and count out all the slices, this move, which was reflexive for the experienced cook, made excellent use of the available space as a mental shortcut to the desired goal. By using length to encode the number, she created a cue or signal in the world which she could accurately track. Laying out the slices in lines allows a more precise judgment of the relative number remaining than clustering the slices in groups or piling them up into heaps. Hence, because of the way the human perception system works, lining up the slices creates an observable property that facilitates execution. The way one perceives and uses space is a quality of mastery of a skill. The way one takes the available space into account and manages it is a function of practice and familiarity, and doing it well makes the task easier. Now, space, says Dr. Kirsch, is always present, and the need to place objects somewhere is a constant fact of life. This makes space an invaluable resource to exploit in order to facilitate everyday problem solving and planning. Each week, we invite people to share their triumphs and their setbacks, their celebrations and their heartaches. We'll follow this with a short moment of silence and a musical interlude. Nothing was actually submitted for me to read, but I think it's safe to say that a week like this has been hard for some of us, and excellent for some of us, and for many of us, it's been a little of both. Let us then give thanks for our shared humanity. Marvel in the fact that we are made of stardust, but we are able to see and ponder and measure the stars. Let us remember that in a time of upheaval and loss, there are still things to celebrate, and that the history of human race has been slow and unsteady progress towards a more just, a more knowledgeable, and more compassionate. Now, a moment of silence. Nisha. My second question this morning is, why does it seem humans have a need to define things? Why do we need to create boundaries and borders and labels? In my first response, I talked about the importance of dividing space. The thing that makes the fork useful where the spoon is not is how the fork divides space differently from the spoon. That also applies to concepts and ideas. We're natural pattern seekers, to the point where many of us see faces in the grain of wood or the shadows on rocks. We see patterns where none were intended because we want to make sense of things. And we once needed to make sense of things in this way because when things weren't random, it often meant something was alive, whether that was prey or predator. And so our minds are made for patterns and definitions. Most of us are more comfortable when things are familiar, or at least organized so that we can take them in. Like that cook with the lines of peppers and tomatoes, we look for ways to simplify the world so that we can make sense of it and take in more information. Definitions, then, are about categorizing and making connections. There's a reason that in the dictionary, along with the definition, there's usually a synonym or two about the word. Making those connections is part of having a definition. All definitions are about relationship. What is this thing in relationship to other things or ideas? But a definition is almost as much about what a thing isn't as what it is. Every definition draws a line that says things on this side are, and things on that side are not. We need to know what a thing isn't to know what it is. A fork and a spoon can sometimes be equally useful, either because either can do the job well, or because neither can. A spoon, though, can spread butter about as well as a knife, and a fork cannot. Sometimes, like for adding sugar to coffee, only a spoon will do. Borders are really just political definitions. Things on this side of the line are Fort Worth rather than Arlington. Things on this side of this other line are Tarrant County instead of Dallas. We need those lines to function, if not as individuals, then as groups, because we can't convey the whole messiness of the universe without breaking it into concepts. We need to create a notation for music, for instance, so that we can transmit the idea of a song, even though there are infinite unnamed wavelengths between D and D sharp. Lines had to be drawn and definitions had to exclude those wavelengths so that music could be readable. We name the colors, even though they're all similarly subtle differences in wavelengths. Blue is simpler to convey than saying 470 nanometer wavelength, even though blue is a lot less specific. In proxemics, the distance surrounding a person forms a space, or really three different spaces. There's a space between hugging and talking to close friends that's called the personal space. The space between the close interactions and social interaction is called the social space. And all the space within which you can be heard or seen is called the public space. But even those aren't hard lines, and they can be different for each of us on different days and based on how we're feeling or how we feel about the person we're interacting with in the moment. The science recognizes this, and so the outer limit of personal space is listed as being between 6 and 18 inches, a difference of 3 times as much. And so we have to remember that many of our definitions are messy. When does cyan switch from blue to green? The lines for Tarrant County may be neatly drawn, but how big is the metroplex? Which cities are suburbs? And whose suburbs are they? Most definitions, then, are approximations. Where we can't measure a thing or weigh it or count it, well, then there's usually room for interpretation. Definitions are just a way of making sense of a big, messy universe so that we can really start to understand one another. One of the great things about being able to communicate about where our boundaries are is that we can learn from the experiences of others, their success and especially their mistakes, so that we increase our chances at the former and less of the latter. It helps occasionally to step back, to try to see the big picture, and to admit that things are often more complicated than we're comfortable admitting, and that we're making guesses some of the time. And as a devout Unitarian Universalist, I hold as a tenet of my faith that your guess just might be as good as mine. Celebrate the messiness with me now as we sing hymn 134, if you have the gray hymnal at hand. Our world is one world. The words, but not the musical notation, will be on your screen.
Our world is one world. What touches one affects us all. The seas that wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is one world. The thoughts we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes with love or hate, we make a bridge or wall. Our world is one world. Its ways of wealth affect us all. The way we spend, the way we share, who are the rich or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is one world, just like a ship that bears us all, where fear and greed make many holes, but where our hearts can hear a different call.
Our world is one world. The thoughts we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes with love or with hate, we make a bridge or a wall. Bridges are great. They're a boundary that allows things to pass back and forth, but not unimpeded or freely. But the truth is that sometimes, in some situations, what you need is a wall. Sometimes you want travel back and forth to be limited, and you just don't always have a river handy to act as a natural boundary. So, how do we set healthy boundaries? If a definition is as much about what something excludes as what it includes, then a healthy boundary is as much about what we let in as it is about what we keep out. If your boundary, for instance, is too stiff, too defensive, it might end up keeping you from receiving well-intended gifts or even getting help when you really need it. Our world is indeed one world, and the game of life is a massive multiplayer experience which none of us was meant to go through alone. Still, you do have to have limits to what you can give others while still taking care of yourself. And you're more responsible to some people than to others. Boundaries, then, help you maintain your priorities. Keeping the right distance helps you maintain perspective. How we manage the space between ourselves and others is vital to mastering our own lives. How we allow that space to be used is vital to being a healthy and productive member of a community. Letting people know the best ways to make requests, the kinds of requests most likely to be honored, and the priority that their request takes will help you set clear expectations among your neighbors and your friends. Making sure to let people know in a kind way that you're all booked up helps them to understand what you need in return. Telling them when you're stressed or overworked allows them to give you the space and the time you need. Knowing how to ask and who to ask when you need help is the other side of this relationship. Respecting the boundaries of others while letting them return favors and build connections. It's also healthy. Even when so many of us struggle with being vulnerable and honest. And some people take too much or expect too much in return, and they need to be told no. Many may even need to be told, "You are not a priority. You may not use my time and energy." Or, "I need space." It's not cruel to protect yourself. In fact, it's almost universally recognized as an essential part of being able to help anyone else at all. And so a healthy boundary can be a bridge or a wall, depending on the relationship between the people or parties. A healthy set of boundaries is vital to having a healthy relationship, whether it's with a family member or a friend or a whole congregation. So, what does a healthy boundary look like? I'm not an expert, but I've done some reading, and I think the first step is to evaluate your own needs. These are going to change, and they're going to keep changing, and you have to keep track of what your needs are, and that's no small chore on its own. But taking time to think through your goals and your relationships and your priorities on a regular basis is a good idea that will help you establish your boundaries with others. Next, you examine the relationship and the needs of the people or organizations involved. Ask, why do you have these relationships? How do they fit with your priorities? You might be willing to give more to someone or some group if doing so helps you achieve something in return or makes the world a better place to live in. Understand that it's much easier to open up a restrictive boundary than to try to rein in one that's been poorly maintained. It's okay to start with tight boundaries, with the understanding that you may be willing to open up as you get comfortable. Healthy people will understand. Set limits and make them clear. Tell people what to expect from you, where it ranks on your priorities, and what you expect or what to expect if you don't follow through. You don't owe your time to any specific person, and if you're setting healthy boundaries, healthy people will respect that. Lastly, do not be ashamed of your boundaries, but be willing to listen. The other party will have expectations and boundaries of their own, and if they bring up a conflict, hear them out. Make sure both sides are understood. You can't come to an agreement without first having a mutual understanding. And address concerns as soon as they come up. Again, it's better to be cautious at first and make sure that understanding is maintained. Once you let something go, it'll be much harder to address it the next time it happens. That said, there's nothing wrong with addressing it graciously if the other person either apologizes or if it seems there was a misunderstanding. You're not wrong to enforce your boundaries, but you're also not wrong for letting something pass if an understanding has been assured. Setting healthy boundaries going into the new year can help you refresh existing relationships and ensure that new ones will be mutually beneficial and pleasant. Like definitions, boundaries are about relationships. Some people need and deserve more of our time and energy than others, and we should acknowledge that and respect it in others. In this way, we build healthy families and communities where who you are is defined by your choices and the relationships that you foster, rather than the prejudice and assumption of others. Join me now in singing our closing hymn, all about those connections and those definitions through relationship. We are. It's hymn number 1051 if you have a gray hymnal. The words will be on your screen.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage and fathers of time. We are daughters of dust and the sons of great vision. We're sisters of mercy and brothers of love. We are lovers of life and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage and fathers of time. We are daughters of dust and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy and brothers of love. We are lovers of life and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each of the morning star rises and sings, we are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are.
As we gently snuff out our candle for the night, let us remember our principles do not reflect the day we've had or the world that we live in, but they are our best guess at what beloved community will look like. Let our actions always lead us closer to a world where justice and compassion lead every person to embrace their worth and dignity, so that we may each seek truth and meaning and find balance within the interdependent web of all existence. We extinguish this flame, but only because we carry its meaning in our own hearts, where it will keep us warm until we are together in spirit again. Thank you for joining your spirit with ours this morning. I return your attention to you that you might give it elsewhere. Go in love and with my hope that you've learned something today that you will carry with you, that you will use or teach to another, so that my words help you build a better relationship and our beloved community. Misha, will you play us out?